It is
right. And and when you talk about, this goes back to the okay, who are the people that vote via Dropbox or absentee?
mhm.
Um, People that work on Tuesday afternoon and either have to go before they go to work, and then if they have to stand in line for a couple hours, they're gonna have to get out of the line,
Mhm.
or they're gonna have to go vote after work, but they need to get home because the babysitter's got the kids or grandma's got the kids or whatever, and if they're standing in line till like 8, 9, 10 o'clock, these are the people it impacts.
Right.
It's real people's lives. We dehumanize these things a lot about
Mhm.
the it is a burden on parents to have your babysitter for extra couple hours on a Tuesday night, or you got to get up, get the kids to school, and get the polling place, get in and out before you got to get to work, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, these are all real things that we forget the human element of a lot of this.
Yeah, this
Uh,
it's
right. I mean, it is Georgia. I mean, it's November for the general election, but it's still Georgia, right? And
see, it's not even so much the November election, right? It's the primaries, it's the
the
caucuses, right?
primary engine, right?
It's those earlier processes that affect where this comes in effect, and it's not even just a presidential election, right? Because like that's that is a problem within the problem, right? To take a side note, ladies and gentlemen, me and Keith have had this voting conversation for a long time, so this is this is not nothing new to us, but to where people tend to fall short, me included, is we tend to not vote for the people who are making the laws that affect us voting, right? That's where the problem is, right? So it's not, hey, I voted for my primary or my caucuses. Great. But you didn't vote for the person that makes up the electoral college that can decide your fate. That's who you didn't vote for. That's where the mistake
Well,
is.
right. And you were discussing earlier, you know, what is Georgia, right? Georgia's blue. No, hold up, right? Georgia's at most purple, right?
Right.
And you say, how does this law come to be? All right. Although Georgia is going for Biden, right? It has a Republican governor, and not just a Republican governor, of openly Trump ally governor.
Mm-hmm.
A We'll get to the Secretary of State later, I know, but all the statewide offices are held by Republicans until the 2020 runoff with the two senators, right?
Well, 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 let's get into it now. Let's get into it now.
But the Georgia House of Representatives, this is where it is, right? People don't vote in midterms.
Mm-hmm.
Democrats don't show up in midterms. The Georgia House of Representatives has to do gerrymandering too, so that's a different situation. But heading into 2020, the Georgia House of Representatives was 105 to 73 in favor of the Republicans. In 2020, the Democrats gained 3 seats.
Mm-hmm.
Republicans lost 2. So the Republicans still control the end of 2020, 103 to 76. Right? We saw nationwide of oh my gosh, the voter fraud. Oh my gosh, all these Democratic ballots. The Democrats are very bad at voter fraud, hypothetically, because although they won the presidential election, they lost seats in the House of Representatives federally, didn't gain any seats in the Senate, didn't take control of any of the state legislatures they were close to getting. Biden won Michigan by a very healthy margin.
Right.
Democrats still lost both houses in the Michigan legislature, and this happened countrywide, Pennsylvania and Arizona and New York, everywhere, right? Laws are made by state legislatures and city councils and local school boards.
Mm-hmm.
And Democrats do not compete in these elections, or don't turn out, right? And some of it's gerrymandering, some of it's other issues, but
and some of it's because Democrats are just dumb. Like, let's just put it out there. You know what I mean? Like, they just got very fortunate with this past election that Stacy Abrams, right? Stacy Abrams. Oh, forgive me. I always get her last name messed up. She's the queen. She is that boss, right? But the Democrats got very lucky that she went out there and those of her ilk, the women of the WNBA who were against the Atlanta Dream owner Loeffler, they went out and campaigned against her. The Democrats got very lucky because the Democratic Party always does this trick. Instead of trying to promote and try to help the the minorities who do vote Democratic and lift them up, they always try to go to the other side middle. Like they always try to get like the middle Republicans and try to like, hey, come to our side. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? They're not going to leave their base to come to you because you feel that their leader is bad. They're going to vote how they're going to vote. Focus on us down here who are undecided, right? Who you need to focus on the groups. And I know we sidetracked, but whatever, it's my show. We need to focus on the groups that you will be surprised would vote Republican, right? So I'll give you an example. In 2000, I think it was 2000, 2004, like I can't remember which one. Maybe it was both. George W. Bush won the black church vote. Why? Because the Republican views and belief system of anti-abortion falls in line with
marriage,
right? And marriage and anti homosexual marriage falls in line with the black church belief system. So George Bush won that because of those belief systems. So when I go to the Democrats, say, hey, I know you're trying to win over name a middle person Republican who might be in the edges. Why don't you go down to the black church and try to win them over if you can? You know what I mean? And you mentioned voter fraud, and I'm glad you mentioned voter fraud because that's always a hot word for the last 4 or 5 months. So election officials can no longer accept third-party funding, and people who that's probably legal nerd speak for people that says, hey, I guess they can't take I guess this is a direct response to 2020 specifically, right, with COVID, where these third-party companies and organizations were donating funds to polling sites and stuff. Like that's in response to that, right? I'm assuming.
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't studied it too much, but basically it limits money that election officials can take to official government funds, either from the state, the county, or the federal government. So that allow voting organizations on either side to, donate money or supplies or to election boards. No one can donate Sharpies.
Right. Which
that can of worms.
all that stuff. How speaking of that, polling side stuff, how rare do you get the situation where a judge, in Georgia, I guess is very common, unfortunately, where machines will go down, power will go out, a judge can extend the time to their discretion. In this new law, they have to follow the exact time. So if the power goes out for 24 minutes, the judge can only extend it for 24 minutes. How significant is that, if any, and how I guess rare is that really happens, that judges, you have to pick up the phone, judge, can we get more time?
Judges extending voting times is rare. It makes the news when it happens, right? It tends to happen in urban areas, in African American areas where the equipment, ironically or not, is older and malfunctions more often, or water pipes burst in a polling center, oddly, on election day.
Right.
It happens in rural areas too, but you knock out a large urban voting center, you're talking tens of thousands of votes, at a precinct.
Mm-hmm.
The voters that get affected by this, and people that stay, machines get down or they run out of ballots. A lot of this time, in the primary election in 2018, or was it more in 2018 because COVID, so many people voted absentee. Counties are running out of ballots. And then they got to stand there, and the machines are down, whatever it is. The internet's not working, and everyone's got to stand there. So the judge, they go to one of the attorneys, local attorneys that's working for one of the parties in that county, walks over to the courthouse and says, "Judge, we need to keep the polls open." Now, interestingly, I don't know. I have to research this. A lot of those cases are filed in federal court.
Okay.
State ain't gonna be able to tell a federal judge what is constitutional federally. It'll be interesting to see if voting groups say that provision of this law is violates the federal constitution in some way. I haven't looked into that completely yet, but there's definitely arguments to be made there.
Right.
If it violates the federal constitution, it's not enforceable. The judiciary is very protective of its power and being
very much so.
It's not uncommon for a legislature or an executive to try to tell the judiciary what to do, and the judiciary says that law is unconstitutional. And through the referee, and they get to decide when the things that people tell them what to do is legal or not. So
yeah, it is.
Fight, and that could create, and if it's a challenge, a midnight ruling by SCOTUS or something on election night would be, God, you want to talk about a political, the cable media wars.
Well, I mean, so you bring up the SCOTUS real quick. I mean, about they are the referees. They could just throw the technical in your face. Except their technical is, what you want, not constitutional. Bye. See you later. And I mean, the biggest, the judiciary holding your power, winning its power. For me, one of the more, I'm not gonna say more recent time, the last 20 years, is the 2000 election with Gore and Bush, right? Even though it was. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. Those who have not seen it, it's my light is freaking out. It's by Billy Corben, 537. He speaks of I think it's 537, 534, where he speaks of how the Cuban Americans in Florida were the deciding factor in that voting process. But my recollection, and if those who have more memory than I do can remember, I felt like we were investigated, and then the Supreme Court was like, "All right, Bush, your president," and everybody was like, okay. And we just kind of just went on forward from there. We was like, no one asked any more questions.
How it happened. Yep.
Like we didn't have a president. SCOTUS said, you know what? We need a president. Bush, you the man. And Gore's like, oh, okay. And he just kind of left to go change the climate. And everyone was like, why didn't you fight that? He was like, well, climate change. I'm like, but you could have been the president. Climate change. Like, all right, Gore.
Well, and there's interesting issues of state law there that in 2000 were on the opposite, where there are challenges to many things in 2020 with the Trump campaign going, I think it's 1 for 64 by most people's counts in court. And that one is kind of a generous categorization to call it a win for interesting reasons. But basically, Bush had the arguments that Biden had this time. Both state laws were on the side of Bush at the time. So, Bush was on much firmer legal ground than Trump was. And the efficacies of Bush v. Gore are a whole other topic.
I never thought we would say today or here today we would be like Bush had more legal ... than than anyone.
Well, and I mean, it's the story of the Trump administration, right? They were really bad at administrative law.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't their policies per se, in which they were really bad at administrative law. But
yeah, we one day we can get into the story of our AP government class. Everyone at the same time rose their hands, and our teacher knew what the question was. It was after one of his State of the Unions and defeatism. Remember that, where he had said in his speech, defeatism, and everyone rose their hand. And then one of the best government history persons we ever met. Yes, class, defeatism is a word. Yes, he didn't use it correctly. I know no one ever says that. So it was a funny situation. Going through this law, there are some things, like I said before at the beginning of this, folks, I tend to say I'm smart, but Keith is more political of the two of us, right? Bring Damien in here. Keith is more political of the three of us. Okay. And it's a very interesting dynamic because Damien tends to go more, conservative. Keith tends to go more his belief system. I don't ever like saying the word liberal because liberal makes me want to like suck on my teeth. Okay, like it or I should probably use a different phrase. It makes me very angry. It's like the word millennial. Like I want to fight people every time I hear that because it's like you're not smart enough to come up with a better word. Anyway, going through this, there are a few things that I didn't understand or know. So part of that misunderstanding or not understanding is a state election board. Did you find something on that? Can you explain that to me and the people what that is?
Yeah, so basically in Georgia, I'm getting this information from the official Georgia State Secretary of State website, georgia.gov. The state election board in Georgia basically is in charge of making election rules, overseeing the administration of those rules, election regulations, furnishing the laws to the county election officials, distributing information, voter education drives, all that kind of stuff, and then advising the state legislature on how to change election laws. So one of the things that you're referring to is the Georgia voting law, the one we're discussing, took it used to be that the chairman of this state election board was the Secretary of State of Georgia, elected position. Again, is currently Brad Raffensperger, a Republican, a kind of a more business Republican, corporate Republican more than so than a cultural Republican, and took the Secretary of State away from being chairman of that board to being a non-voting member of that board, and put that state election board under the realm of the state attorney general. And I think your question is, why did they do that?
Yeah. Going through this, especially the later parts, you see an attack on the Secretary of State specifically, and yeah, I am curious of why that is.
So, if we all remember, maybe there is some rational basis for doing this. Typically, in most states, the Secretary of State is in charge of elections, like here it is in Michigan. That's typically how it works. To most people, this stinks of some personal revenge by allies of the 45th president, Mr. Raffensperger. If we all remember that as Georgia was voting and as Georgia was counting votes, and as Georgia is DeKalb and Fulton and Gwinnett County and John Lewis's county all came in, which, of course, as a side, great irony that the county that turned Georgia blue on election night was John Lewis's county, for whatever that's worth to people. Our former president very famously called the Secretary of State of Georgia and said, just find me 11,000 votes. Find this. Lindsey Graham supposedly is called. There are criminal investigations going on.
Okay.
In terms of this, state Georgia officials, Senator Graham, President Trump, are not happy with Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger for certifying the Georgia election, not throwing out the election, not finding quote unquote the 12,000 votes. So this move by most observers is a personal attack by Trump allies on the current Georgia Secretary of State.
You said it was going to be simple. When we talked about it before the show.
A one-man egos parade of the 45th president against Raffensperger. There's recall efforts against Raffensperger. There's censure efforts, just like there were censure efforts and recall efforts against the Republican members of the House that voted for impeachment. Raffensperger leaked the contents of the phone call. He leaked the audio of the phone call he had with the president. So the president's allies are very unhappy with him.
So they are launching all the attacks. Well, you know what? That explanation makes plenty of sense. We have one more nerdy thing to get into, folks, and then we're gonna have some fun. You know what I mean? Fun. I mean, we're gonna call out other people who have the same problem. Runoff elections. This is one of those. I don't know how you describe it, Keith. Sexy but not sexy things about politics, right? So one of the most famous runoffs that come to my memory is the David Duke runoff in 1991. For those who do not know, this is a great podcast on Slate called Slow Burn. It speaks of David Duke. David Duke was a neo-Nazi supporter. David Duke was the former head of a part of the Ku Klux Klan. David Duke was voted to a state representative in Louisiana. I think it was the 9th Ward in 1980, late 1980s. And he was running for governor in the early 90s. So when people say racism is so far long ago, remember, I have been alive long enough to see David Duke try to run for governor, and he almost won with his runoffs, eventually, except a tape video or an audio tape of him supporting Nazism. Because that's the one thing, you can be racist, but they don't want you to be like Nazi racism because Jews, because that's that stuff, anti-Semitic stuff. So he ended up not getting it with runoffs, and I think Georgia didn't they have a runoff or having a runoff right now? Is that what's happening? Did I just miss
Georgia
that?
had both, and an odd quirk of Senate election law.
Okay.
Both U.S. senators in Georgia, their seats were open, and both elections went to a runoff that was held in early January. Because in Georgia, you have to get the winning candidate in the statewide office has to get to 50%. The same thing happened in the Stacy Abrams Brian Kemp race in Georgia in 2018. Somebody has to be 50%. So you run the general election, and because of how third party election, the full elections work, and you have third, fourth, fifth, eighth parties, whatever it is, the winner often doesn't get 50%, right? The presidential election is it's rare for someone to get over 50% anymore.
So Georgia just took this and they just sped it up. They just took it and say, hey, the runoff time frame is almost virtually cut in half.
Yeah. So let me get my days right.
Yeah, because a lot of this is written down, but a lot of this is off of the cover. I make the mistake of being old, folks, and thinking that I'll remember it, and then I get on here and then I don't, and then I don't remember it. I just rely on my charms and wit to get me through these discussions. As most of us, I guess, try to do in life, right? Try to get through in these things. And I think Louisiana was the same thing with David Duke in the 90s, where you had that 50%, and he didn't get the
Louisiana.
Louisiana, yeah.
I know California is interesting in its primary system is a jungle primary system. But yeah, so Georgia, someone has to get 50%. So in the general election, a lot of times no one gets 50%, and they have to hold a runoff. The runoff used to be on the Tuesday of the 9th week following the general election. So 9 times 7.
60. 72, 63. 63.
63 days after the election, right? Ish, right?
Right, ish, right.
9th week. So 60, 70 days. Now the election will be 28 days later. So think about that. That means basically
in a month,
no voter registration drive.
Right.
People have to print ballots, right? You got to remember that, like in the presidential election, with the electoral college, each state gets 5 weeks to certify the results.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 5 weeks is longer than 28 days. So the election results might not even be certified yet. And then there's the quirk that, people forget about this, they get into the partisan, with the now partisan argument about mail-in voting.
Mm-hmm.
Americans living overseas, including soldiers, the military,
mm-hmm.
by mail-in ballot. Those ballots get sent out to them before the election. Those military voters and Americans living overseas are going to have to get one ballot now, where they're going to get ranked choice voting, so that they won't get a special election ballot. They will have to rank their choices in order to determine who their top candidate is for the runoff.
Is it? Let me ask you something before we get to the supposed fun. With all that's happening right now in 2020, 2021, is it worse now just because it's on the secret than it was, let's just say 50 years ago? Because 50 years ago, right, it was all in the open. When I would say you would have people with billy clubs and dogs standing in front of polling stations to keep you from voting, right? The open intimidation was there. But now we're doing sneak things like this, where you mentioned the military as people who cannot vote, right? People who are released from jail for whatever the reasons, their voting rights are taken away. Is it worse now than what it was before? Or is that a question that needs deeper thought, deeper meditation, and then coming back with some numbers and facts? Because I'm really just sitting here, and as we're going through this, I'm like, yo, in 2021, this shouldn't happen. But it's happening.
Right. Well, yes, more study and a broader conversation. But if you remember, universal mail-in voting is still novel, right?
Right.
In Washington, either Washington or Oregon, I'm missing out which one it is, has been doing it for, I think, since 2000 or 2010.
Okay.
Utah followed soon after. Colorado's done it for an election or two now. Florida is getting there, but isn't quite universal.
Mm-hmm.
Universal mail-in voting is still rather new. Michigan just adopted no reason absentee just a couple of years ago. Early voting is still early in-person voting. The polling places set up in malls and convention centers, everything is still a rather novel concept. But it wasn't that long ago that election day was still, election day was Tuesday, right?
Right.
And there are still arguments that legal arguments that election day is Tuesday to some people.
You mentioned those polling places. The mayor of Miami, I believe he's a Republican and stuff. They had a problem down there where instead of making the Arisons and Eric Spoelstra, the coach of the Miami Heat, owners of the Miami Heat, had campaigned to have the United Airlines Arena. It's called something else now. Be the polling site. Be the site where people can come because everybody knows where the United Airlines Arena is. Everyone knows what it is.
And the same happened for Ford Field, and I think all the major sports teams around the country offered their stadiums up for polling.
Right. Except
for COVID.
Right, exactly. Except the mayor of Miami says, nah, thanks, but we're gonna make it the museum down the street. So it just adds another layer to the undercover suppression.
So why, let's go back to your title of your show. Why is that a problem for certain people maybe more than others?
So, well, because like we brought up, people tend to, humans are creatures of habit, right? We go to landmarks, we go to things that we comfort with, that we know that have great transportation. I don't know what the transportation in Miami is like, but I'm sure, well, I hear it's terrible. I hear I-95 is awful, but there are bus transportation that will probably take you close to the United Airlines Arena, right? There are ways to get you to that arena. People know that arena, thus making it easier to vote. Going to some museum down the street that no one knows, it will deter people from voting. It will deter people from actually coming down there. And it is targeted in areas of poor, minority communities that deter them from coming down there.
So would you see a problem if your analogy would be to Detroit, right, not using Ford Field, instead using the DIA, which again, right downtown, right kind of in that area, but is that a problem for some people? Would that deter some people that may vote at Ford Field and not at the DIA? I mean, we all know the DIA famously has some inclusivity issues in the city of
right. And in the city of Detroit, famously have had its fights with its residents about buildings and landmarks and things like that. That's definitely an issue when it comes to that, when you bring it home.